Nazi and Zionist collaboration in the migration of Jews to Palestine. Introduction. The history of the Jewish migration to Palestine in the early 20th century is deeply complex, shaped by multiple forces, ideologies, and geopolitical realities. Among the many chapters in this history, one often debated topic concerns the collaboration between high-ranking Nazis and prominent Zionists in facilitating the migration of Jews to Palestine. According to some accounts, this collaboration was not only strategic, but also involved the Zionists' willingness to sacrifice some of their own people in order to create the extreme sense of fear and urgency necessary to galvanize Jewish immigration. This report delves into these events, investigating the circumstances that led to this cooperation, the roles played by the key figures, and the chilling consequences for the Jewish population this tumultuous period. The origins of Nazi-Zionist collaboration, the strange and controversial intersections between Nazi officials, Zionist leaders, and questions surrounding Adolf Hitler's own origins, from a shadowy chapter of 20th century history. According to Hans Frank's memoirs, In the Face of the Gallows, Hitler, suspecting rumors of his Jewish ancestry, personally commissioned Frank in 1930 to investigate. Frank's findings unearthed circumstantial evidence suggesting that Hitler's grandmother, Anna Maria Schicklgruber, may have conceived his father Alois while working in the home of a Jewish man, Frankenberger in Graz, during the 1830s, and she later received financial support from this family for 14 years. This theory received further backing from a genetic study of 39 of Hitler's living relatives, which reportedly found markers consistent with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. More recently, psychologist and physician Leonard Sachs published a study titled Aus den Gemeinden von Burgenland in the Journal of European Studies, reinforcing Frank's original claims. Sachs explored archival evidence and debunked earlier objections by historian Nikolaus von Peradovich, who falsely claimed that Jews did not live in Graz before 1856. Sachs showed that a Jewish community indeed existed in Graz prior to that date, citing historical records and writings from the period, including those of Emanuel Mendel Baumgarten. According to Frank's account, corroborated by Sachs, Hitler's grandmother received hush payments from the Frankenberger family out of fear of scandal, suggesting that the boy who would become Hitler's father was likely the son of a Jewish man. Sachs concluded that the prevailing historical dismissal of Frank's claims was driven by Nazi sympathizers like Peradovich, and that Frank, not Peradovich, was telling the truth. While Hitler's ancestry remains officially unsettled, these findings reopen serious questions about the man who led a regime obsessed with racial purity. Furthermore, a genetic study conducted by Belgian journalist Jean-Paul Mulders and historian Mark Vermeeren in 2010 analyzed hair samples retrieved from a brush believed to belong to Eva Braun, Adolf Hitler's longtime companion and wife during the final days of World War II. DNA testing on the hair revealed markers associated with the mitochondrial haplogroup N1b1, which is strongly associated with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. This surprising discovery, suggesting that Eva Braun may have had Jewish maternal lineage, adds another layer of irony and complexity to the ideological foundations of the Nazi regime, which vehemently persecuted those of Jewish descent. Linguistically, the similarity between Nazi and Ashkenazi appears striking. While the phonetic overlap between Nazi and the latter part of Ashkenazi is curious, some have noted the irony or speculated about deeper symbolic or psychological significance, especially given the Nazis' persecution of Ashkenazi Jews. This linguistic curiosity becomes even more unsettling when viewed alongside the broader historical picture, which reveals that during the 1930s, Nazi officials and Zionist leaders engaged in a collaboration and by shared goals regarding Jewish emigration. The relationship between Nazi officials and Zionist leaders is often portrayed as an opportunistic alliance. While the idea of collaboration between Nazis and Zionists may seem contradictory, The historical reality reveals pragmatic religious and political maneuvering. In the mid-1930s, as Nazi Germany began to rise under Adolf Hitler, the regime's premeditated anti-Semitic policies were being implemented with increasing aggression. Simultaneously, Zionist leaders in Palestine were working tirelessly to secure a future for Jews, at the expense of the native Palestinian population. By establishing a national homeland in the already inhabited land they came to call Israel. Both groups premeditatively rejected the idea of Jews fully blending into European societies as the solution. To understand how and why Nazi officials and Zionist leaders may have pursued a collaborative strategy, it is crucial to consider the geopolitical context and the specific aims of both groups. The Nazi perspective. The Nazi narrative was to view Jews as a subhuman race that needed to be eradicated, exactly how Israelis want the world to see Palestinians today. However, early on, Hitler's regime sought to solve the Jewish question by means other than mass murder. Nazi officials, including Adolf Eichmann, considered the emigration of Jews from Germany and occupied territories to be a more practical solution, especially in the late 1930s, before the full-scale Holocaust, driven in part by a covert collaboration between Zionist leaders and the Nazi regime, unfolded. Blame was largely placed on the Nazis alone, but that is only half the truth. Some Zionist factions actively collaborated with the Nazis, believing that the sacrifice of a portion of European Jewry would pressure the survivors to abandon assimilation and instead embrace Zionism by emigrating to Palestine. The emigration policy was meant to rid Germany of Jews, while keeping the Jewish problem at arm's length from the Third Reich. This opened a door for negotiations with Zionists who were committed to the establishment of a Jewish state. The Zionist perspective. Zionist leaders were also under immense pressure to achieve their goal of Jewish immigration to Palestine. After years of British restrictions and self-inflicted rising anti-Semitism across Europe, many Zionists were desperate to secure a safe haven for Jews. The collaboration with Nazi officials seemed pragmatic for some, given that Hitler's regime, through the Haavara Agreement of 1933, allowed Jews to emigrate to Palestine, with the provision that their assets would be liquidated and transferred to the Jewish National Fund in Palestine, thereby aiding the economic development of the future Jewish state. The Haavara Agreement was signed in August 1933, marking the beginning of a chapter of Nazi-Zionist cooperation. It facilitated over 60,000 Jews to emigrate from Germany to Palestine. This pact symbolized the paradoxical and disturbing convergence of racial politics, geopolitical ambition, and ethnic nationalism. A convergence that reveals unsettling undercurrents beneath the surface of official narratives. The Haavara Agreement. A controversial pact, the Haavara Agreement remains one of the most contentious aspects of Nazi-Zionist relations. Through this agreement, Nazi officials facilitated the emigration of Jews to Palestine, allowing them to escape the increasingly hostile environment in Germany. In return, Zionist organizations, particularly the Jewish Agency in Palestine, received economic support for the development of infrastructure in Palestine, which would later form the backbone of the State of Israel. Many critics argue that this alliance was driven by cold pragmatism, where Zionists were willing to work with the Nazis to secure Jewish migration, despite the horrific political realities surrounding the Holocaust. Within Jewish history, two different approaches have emerged. One group has been willing to sacrifice some of their own people to protect the rest or achieve political goals. The other group refuses to harm any members of their community, valuing everyone's safety and dignity above all. The Haavara Agreement was dissolved in 1939 as the situation in Europe escalated and war broke out. However, its existence remains a focal point in discussions about Zionist-Nazi relations, especially when evaluating the ethical choices made by both parties. The role of violence and fear in facilitating Jewish migration. Another chilling aspect of this period is the claim that Zionist factions used violence to manipulate and control the Jewish population, fostering a sense of extreme fear and desperation. Certain Zionist militant groups engaged in violent acts against Jews themselves in order to force them to flee Europe for Palestine. In the 1930s and 1940s, extremist Zionist groups like the Irgun, led by Menahem Begin, who would later become Israel's prime minister, and the Stern Gang, 𝗍𝗍𝗲, were involved in acts of terrorism against both British authorities in Palestine and Palestinian Arabs. However, there is evidence suggesting that some of these groups may have also directed violence towards Jews in Europe, particularly in the period leading up to the establishment of the State of Israel. The Night of Broken Glass, one of the most infamous acts of anti-Semitic violence in Germany, occurred on the night of the 9th of November, 1938, when Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes were destroyed. While this was orchestrated by Nazi authorities, some researchers suggest that elements within the Zionist movement were not entirely uninvolved, with the argument being that violence and chaos would drive Jewish migration to Palestine. Violence in Europe and the fear factor. Some reports and testimonies suggest that Zionist militant groups had a hand in fostering the atmosphere of terror by exaggerating the threat of anti-Semitic violence, or even instigating such acts to create a sense of urgency among the Jewish population. For example, the assassination of prominent Jewish figures, the targeting of Jews who were seen as obstacles to Zionist goals, and the fostering of fears regarding the future of Jews in Europe all contributed to the psychological pressure that led many to leave for Palestine. There is a strong historical case that the Zionist cause, at times, benefited from the dramatic increase in anti-Semitic violence in Europe. Zionist and Nazi leaders involved. A number of prominent figures played key roles in the controversial collaboration between the Nazis and Zionists. Adolf Eichmann was one of the chief architects of the Nazi plan to expel Jews from Germany. He played a key role in organizing the immigration of Jews to Palestine as part of the Haavara Agreement. Later, as head of the Jewish Affairs Department in the SS, Eichmann would become infamous for his role in the mass deportations to the death camps during the Holocaust. Chaim Weizmann, leader of the World Zionist Organization and later the first president of Israel, played a key role in negotiating the Haavara Agreement, which facilitated the transfer of thousands of Jews from Germany to Palestine. His dealings with Nazi officials were crucial in enabling Jewish emigration. Menahem Begin, leader of the Irgun and later Israel's prime minister, was a controversial figure whose actions are viewed differently by historians. While he strongly advocated for Jewish independence, Begin's leadership included involvement in violent attacks and acts of terrorism, primarily targeting British authorities and Arab populations during the pre-state period, marking a significant chapter in Zionist militant history. Syncretic shadows, the occult fusion of Nazism, Zionism, and Freemasonry. In the hidden corridors of power during the 20th century, a peculiar and disturbing convergence occurred among certain high-ranking Nazis, Zionists, and Freemasons, a convergence rooted not in ideology alone, but in esoteric religion. Behind the curtain of public politics, these elite actors are believed by some researchers to have engaged in a syncretic Canaanite belief system that fused Baal worship with Yahwehism. In this occult tradition, Baal and Yahweh were not seen as opposing deities, but as dual aspects of the same Godhead, one demanding obedience, the other demanding sacrifice. The darker expressions of this faith allegedly involved human offerings, either to Yahweh directly or to his fiery intermediary, Moloch, interpreted not as a separate entity, but as a consuming form of Yahweh himself. This spiritual and ritualistic worldview, hidden beneath layers of political theater and national mythologies, may have served as a unifying metaphysical thread among elite circles, binding seemingly opposed factions through shared esoteric convictions and sacrificial rites. The Holocaust functioned as an industrial-scale human sacrifice ritual, in which Jewish leaders sacrificed their own people as an offering to Yahweh, with the aim of spiritually justifying or accelerating the creation of the State of Israel. This perspective views the immense suffering and loss as part of a dark, symbolic bargain, where the tragedy was used to galvanize Zionist goals and fulfill religious or mystical visions tied to nation building. This interpretation highlights the complex, often painful intersections of faith, politics, and history surrounding the Holocaust and Israel's founding. Conclusion: a dark chapter in Jewish history. The history of Jewish migration to Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel is deeply intertwined with complex and often unsettling dynamics between Nazi officials and Zionist leaders. Their collaboration, driven by pragmatic and ideological motives, reveals a paradox where the tragic suffering of European Jewry was both a consequence and a catalyst for Zionist ambitions. The Haavara agreements and related efforts exemplify how political expediency sometimes intersected with moral compromise, with some factions allegedly willing to sacrifice parts of their own community to achieve a greater national goal. When viewed through the lens of esoteric beliefs and symbolic interpretations, these events gain an additional, darker dimension, suggesting that the Holocaust itself was framed by some as a ritual sacrifice underlying the birth of Israel. Understanding this fraught chapter requires acknowledging the layers of political strategy, fear, violence, and belief that shaped one of the most consequential periods in modern history.